The New International Version, James 5, 7 to 11, and then Isaiah 35, 1 to 10. So first from James. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And then the Old Testament reading from Isaiah 35. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands. Steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong. Do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become like a pool, the thirsty ground, bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow, and a highway will be there. It will be called the Way of Holiness. The unclean will not journey on it. It will be for those who walk in that way. Wicked fools will not go about on it. They will not be found there. No lion will be there, nor will any ferocious beast get up on it. But only the redeemed will walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. And sorrow and sighing will flee away.
So last week we focused on the passage from John the Baptist in which he called people a brood of vipers, and one of the questions was, why would I pick such a verse to focus on? And I said, well, one of the options might be that I'm just a Grinch and I don't really want anyone to enjoy Christmas, and I don't myself. And I thought I'd prove it by bringing our Christmas tree. So you know what our house feels like around the holidays. In Advent 1, 2 weeks ago, I established the the assertion that things are not right in the world. That's obvious to most of us. Things are not right in the world. And it's why Christmas is such a beloved time of year, because it's an opportunity to decorate, it's an opportunity to celebrate, it's an opportunity to be together with family. The lights and the greenery and the people around us fill us with the hope and joy that seems to be lacking in the world. And especially in the church, we remember Jesus. We remember the hope that Jesus has to bring change for the world in our own lives. And we've been reading Isaiah and seeing the visions of hope that he projects to the people of God. So in the first week, we heard of weapons of war being turned into garden tools. We heard about nations that will stop training for war. In the next week, last week, the scriptures from Isaiah talked about natural enemies that won't harm each other anymore. Wolves and lambs playing together, calves and lions lying down together, and a child shall lead them. And then this morning, we just heard about deserts blooming, deserts being filled with rivers, blind seeing, deaf hearing, the lame leaping, the mute singing God's praises, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. So as we hear the hope from Isaiah, as we understand the hope in Jesus, the goal is to live into that hope for us. When we proclaim that Jesus, through his resurrection, overcame sin and death started to die on that day, we hold out hope. Death began to die the day that Jesus burst from the grave. And we hold out hope that God will fulfill the promise to kill death once and for all. Now, the reality right now is that life is still painful and scary. This is why the holidays can actually be the most excruciating times for us. We see the lights and the celebration, we see the greenery and the joy and the music, and we think about who's not with us this season. We see gifts under trees and we think about our own financial instability. We hear words of hope and joy and promise and see an image of a healthy, beautiful little child. And we think of our own broken bodies, our own broken minds, our own broken relationships. So what do we do? Do we live into hope in a way that ignores the pain and the fear that we experience on a daily basis? Ignorance is bliss, after all, right? I don't know that that's necessarily possible. Imagine the scenario when Mary is in her room at night and an angel of the Lord shows up in whatever glorious splendor, large, shimmering, booming voice we imagine, and the first words are, "Don't be afraid." How effective do you think that was? We don't hear through Mary's story that she wasn't afraid. in response to the phrase, to not be afraid. We hear, however, that she is living in hope and joy because she sings a song of thanksgiving and praise to God, because she goes to visit her relative Elizabeth, and their babies jump for joy in their wombs. But with everything I know about pregnancy, I cannot for the life of me imagine that Mary did not also live with fear, some level of fear. But what we saw was her not letting that fear get the best of her, not letting that fear take over. And there's been lots of psychological research been done by much smarter people than me about what fear does to us and how it changes us. We know some of these things already, but when we are afraid, we typically get ready to fight or flee, or we just freeze like deer in the headlights. When we let fear run the show, we are not our best selves. We make irrational decisions. I had a 3-year experience of fear that I finally overcame. And I don't know how long it took me to admit that it was fear-driven, but I didn't get my driver's license until I was 19 and a half years old. I had just finished my freshman year in college, and finally that summer, I finally got my driver's license. And I never told anyone that fear was the reason, but it was the reason. The first time I went out driving with my dad on the main roads, I remember distinctly not turning hard enough to actually make the turn onto our road, just about going up onto the bank, and Dad shouting and grabbing the wheel and pushing it over, and me slamming on the brakes and stopping right in the middle of the intersection until I could take a deep breath and turn hard over and make it the rest of the way back to the house. And every day after that, when Mom or Dad asked if I wanted to get some practice in, I said, nah, I'll be all right. And for 3 years, I lived in fear because of that moment in which I was driving this gigantic vehicle and could have hurt myself or my dad or someone else, and I couldn't get past that. But I never told anyone that. I just, I don't need it. My parents both teach at the school that I go to, so I always have a ride to school. I have friends that live pretty close. They can take me to basketball practice and home. It's fine. I don't need it, so why go through the problem all the time it takes? But ultimately, it was fear. There's all sorts of negative aspects for fear. When we are afraid of being harmed, when we are afraid of death, we are willing to harm other people. We are willing to kill other people because we are afraid of harm ourselves. We are afraid of dying. When we are afraid of not measuring up and not being enough, we run ourselves ragged to prove to somebody that we are enough. And we harm ourselves in the process. When we're afraid of losing someone or something, we hold on extra tight and we smother because we don't want to lose him or her or that thing. We're afraid of being wrong, so we hold on to so tightly to certain beliefs and are unable to meet new people, to hear new perspectives, to have new ideas that might be different or might color our beliefs or might actually help them to grow. We get separated from people when we're afraid, when we let fear drive us. So, again, what do? How do we respond? Well, surprise, surprise, the answer is Jesus. I was thinking again this week about the most profound verse in the Bible, which is also happens to be the shortest. John 11:35. Who knows it? Jesus wept. Jesus cried. John 11:35. Jesus is at the tomb of Lazarus, his friend who died. He knew before he went to the grave that he had died. He knew he had the power and probably knew he was going to bring him back from the dead. If there's anyone in the world at that moment who should have been able to live fully into that hope and ignore the pain and ignore the fear, it would have been Jesus in that moment. And yet he cried. There's something about Jesus' example in which we see knowing and trusting and living into the hope that God provides for us, and yet being very real about the pain and the fear that we experience here and now. And that one little verse, John 11:35, shows it. We see again when Jesus is praying in the garden and is about to go to his death, that something similar happens when he prays and sweats and asks for this thing to be removed from him so he doesn't have to do this thing, this sacrifice, this death. He lives into the hope of God's promise for renewal, and yet in the moment, he is honest about his fears and his pain. And how do we do it? Jesus could do it. Jesus sets the standard. We can live into that. Well, one of the clues, I think, is in James. So the passage for this morning, James says to be patient like farmers waiting for the yields and the rain. So see what I did last week? I called you all a brood of vipers, and then this week I blow sunshine at the farmers and say how awesome you are and how patient you are. So I'm not just dour all the time. I'm trying to build you up as well. James says, be patient like the farmers waiting for the yields, waiting for the rain. And in verse 9, he says specifically, don't grumble against one another. Don't grumble against one another. Now, the word grumble shows up in Romans 8. And in Romans 8, where we hear that is Paul explaining that the creation, the world, grumbles. It groans as a woman in labor, waiting for renewal. And then Paul goes on to say, we ourselves, we who have met Jesus, we who have connected with the Holy Spirit and have this vision for renewal, we grumble, we groan in our inward being because we know that the world is not as it should be. And we ache and groan and wait for that day when it will be the way it should be. What James is seeing is that when we live in the fear, the pain, the achiness, the groaning, what often happens is that we take it out on other people. Our fear and our groaning ends up getting directed at others because it's so painful we can't bear it, and so we're quickly able to lash out when others are around. and don't do things the way we want them to do. So James says, don't grumble against one another. Romans 8 goes on to say that we don't know how to pray as we should, presumably because this groaning is so deep we don't have words for it. And Romans 8 goes on to say, Paul writes, that the Holy Spirit intercedes, the Holy Spirit comes alongside of us and groans alongside of us. The Holy Spirit groans with us. The Holy Spirit also knows that things are not right and prays with us with these aching, longing groanings. So here's our 2 steps for how to hold these things together, this hope and this fear. Step 1 is to be honest about our fears, our deepest fears, our deepest hopes, to name them to ourselves and to God, to understand that when we name them, the Spirit will come alongside us. The Spirit will groan with us. Oftentimes, we don't even recognize how much we are affected by our deepest fears and longings. And so we need to take the time to pay attention to that. What are our deepest fears? And how are they driving us? And can we be honest about them and release them to God? Let the Spirit come and join us. Now, part 2 is, I believe, what James is getting at. When James says, don't grumble against one another, I think what he's not saying, but he's implying is, grumble with one another. If at any point when I was 16, 17, or 18, I had said to my dad or mom or one of my friends, you know, the reason I haven't got my license is I'm actually scared. I'm sure my mature 17-year-old friends would have been very understanding and forgiving. Perhaps a wise one of them, or my parents, or a trusted adult could have said, yeah, it's scary. These are big vehicles that can do a lot of harm. It is scary. I get scared too sometimes when I'm driving on the roads. What would have happened if I would have shared my fear with somebody else? If I had a companion to be with me in that fear. To name that so to release its power. Grumble with each other, groan with each other, spouses, friends, parents and children, small groups, Sunday school classes, this room right here, this gathered body of believers, share our fears and our hopes with each other. So I'm going to make you do that. You're probably wondering why there's Post-it notes in the bulletin. There's 4 Post-it notes in each bulletin. We're going to take just a little bit of time to offer to each other and to God our fears and our hopes. If you have a pen or a pencil and would like to write down a fear and or a hope, you may do that on those Post-it notes. If you need some more, wave a hand at Claire in the back and he can run a bulletin over to you. And then, once you have that on and feel willing, I invite you to stick it on the tree as an act of us coming together to share our hopes and our fears together, to place them at the feet of Christ, to know that we're not alone in our fears, to let go of the power of fear in driving us, and to live into the hope while acknowledging the fear. Because I cannot get past that line from our Christmas hymn that the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. May our hopes and our fears be met in Jesus. I invite you to come when you're ready to offer your hopes and your fears together.